Let's speak English in Quito, Ecuador. I am Stefania Bravo. This is From the South. Former Brazilian President Luiz Inacio Lula Silva has released a letter saying 2019 is the year of resistance and fight. Lula da Silva said it's time for fighting so that the people not be punished by the new government policies. In the letter, he also said that they can arrest a person, but they cannot jail our ideas and future. Lula has been in prison since April 2018, accused of alleged corruption. Lula's letter was released on the day Jair Bolsonaro became the new president of Brazil. Bolsonaro arrived to the parliament in capital Brasilia to take oath. After the swearing-in ceremony, Bolsonaro met Michel Temer, who handed him the presidential sash.
I pledge to defend and respect the Constitution, to observe the laws, to promote the general good of the Brazilian people, to defend the unity, integrity, and independence of Brazil.
And while addressing Parliament, Bolsonaro talked about economy and also the family values, saying he will fight against the ideology of gender.
I take this solemn moment to call all deputies to help me in this mission of restoration and recovery of the homeland, by finally freeing it from the yoke of corruption, criminality, economic responsibility, and ideological submission.
Vamos unir o povo.
We will unite the people, value the family, respect religions and our Judeo-Christian traditions, fight the ideology of gender while preserving our values. Brazil will once again become a country free of ideological chains.
Bolsonaro arrived to Parliament in a luxury car accompanied by his wife, Michelle Bolsonaro. Thousands of people gathered around Congress to support the new president among heavy security. Bolsonaro and his wife paraded through the Esplanade do Ministérios Avenue before arriving to Parliament. And at the same time Bolsonaro was taking oath, hundreds of people gathered outside the police headquarters in Curitiba, where former President Lula da Silva is being held. Supporters threw balloons and flowers in support of the former president. Several leaders from left-wing parties attended the gathering to reject the inauguration. They said they are meeting to discuss strategies to fight against the rise of fascism in Brazil.
For me, Bolsonaro's inauguration means that the election was a farce. It was a fraud. They barred the candidate who was leading. And this was done by a justice system that is completely purchased.
This is a moment when we have to return to our origins. We have to strengthen our bases. It is a period of dialogue in which we have to explain to society what is happening. But more than anything, we have to stay united and strong.
Our correspondent Brian Muir brings us up to date from Curitiba.
I'm here in Curitiba, where at the stroke of 3 p.m. in front of the Federal Police Headquarters, where Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva is being held prisoner, hundreds of people launched red balloons and started chanting, "Free Lula, free Lula." And then the women in the group started throwing flowers over the police station gates. As you can hear now, it's very noisy, they're beginning to sing. But as the PT party has boycotted Jair Bolsonaro's inauguration in Brasilia, Curitiba, specifically in front of where Lula is being held prisoner, has become the focal point for the Brazilian left today. Curitiba, Brian Muir, Telesur.
We thank Brian for that report. United States border agents have fired tear gas at migrants who were trying to cross into the country through Tijuana. Columns of that arose around the border fence as migrants were making their way into U.S. soil during the first hours of the new year. The recent deaths of 2 migrant children while in U.S. border custody intensify the debate over the policies towards migrants. The number of people leaving Honduras has increased since the re-election of Juan Orlando Hernandez, according to experts. More in this report.
The number of people who left Honduras had not changed until the re-election of Juan Orlando Hernandez, a process marked by claims of electoral fraud.
This is the cause of the current crisis. Now re-election is being debated, and people don't see this government as legitimate. We have to resolve these issues that have created crisis after crisis in the country.
The levels of violence and impunity increased in the country after the 2009 coup d'etat. Insecurity grew in neighborhoods and colonies, where the extortion carried out by the maras and gangs displaced thousands of people.
The crime continues because internal security was completely neglected. The fight against drug trafficking became a priority because it was in the agenda of the US. Another problem is the corruption affecting both the national police, the military, and the entire judicial system.
Some corruption cases involving current government officials were left in impunity.
It is said that 5% of budget is lost because of, and that of the size of the gross domestic product, and that can be equivalent to almost $1 billion annually.
Unemployment levels reflect the lack of opportunities for young people. Many who graduate from universities prefer to leave the country, since opportunities are limited to the informal jobs.
This is due to the fact that the current economic model is designed to employ cheap labor force and not specialized labor. The specialized labor is limited to very few, but most of the people who have studied face many difficulties.
Currently, Honduras is shaken by a political and social crisis. Several sectors are organizing an opposition force to pressure the current president to resign and to call for a transitional government.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. 85 former FARC members have been killed in Colombia since the peace agreement was signed 2 years ago, according to the UN. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres asked President Iván Duque to take more efficient actions to protect the former FARC members. A peace agreement was reached by the armed group and the government in 2016, ending a 52-year conflict. It is exactly 25 years since the Zapatista National Liberation Army appeared in Mexico. The indigenous organization shook the country and became one of Latin America's most important social movements. The group promotes the revolutionary ideals of land and liberty and has developed roots throughout Mexico.
The indigenous uprising, carefully prepared for more than 10 years in depths of southern Mexico, took the pre-government by surprise on January 1, 1994. 2 months after it first emerged, the Zapatista army began talks with the government.
We have come with truth and honesty. If there is another way of reaching this point, where this flag flies with democracy, freedom, and justice, show it to us.
With the betrayal of the San Andrés agreements, in which the government promised to recognize indigenous autonomy and self-determination, the ECLN withdrew from the talks, but it pressed on with its agitation and propaganda until 2001. The Zapatista March ended with an appearance before Congress.
There is the country we want, where differences are respected, where living and thinking differently are not a reason to be sent to prison, persecuted, or killed.
While the Zapatistas continued to organize in autonomous communities, they made clear their distrust of elections through their other campaign.
The decomposition of the republic and its values is such that only radical measures can correct this, measures that do not appear in any government program.
The Zapatistas, through peaceful means, had a huge impact on Mexico, especially on civil society.
They showed the younger generation that it was worth struggling, that it was possible to change the course of history, which had not ended, that freedom was possible.
In the so-called shells, the Zapatistas gave an example of self-government and autonomy, open for all to visit and learn from, through the Zapatista schools. They also developed an organization to carry their ideals beyond the hills of Chiapas, the Indigenous Government Council, or CIG.
It's made up equally of men and women, and is present in all areas, carrying on the struggle against capitalist corporations.
It was out of the CIG that came Maria de Jesus Patricio. She is a traditional indigenous doctor and became a candidate for the 2018 presidential election. She didn't get enough signatures to appear on the ballot, but she showed that the Zapatistas' principles remained relevant.
There is only one way to overthrow the capitalist system, and those who have seized everything, who have the money and the power, and that is organization. We see no other way. We have to begin to trust in what we have.
25 years after the San Cristobal uprising, the Zapatista and indigenous role in Mexican political life continues to inspire and educate the younger generations.
The Dominican Republic has become a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council for the first time in its history. The membership was agreed on June 8th in the General Assembly. The Dominican Republic is replacing Bolivia and will take the presidency of the Council for 2019 and 2020. The country is taking one of the seats reserved for Latin American and Caribbean countries. This year saw a shift to the right in several countries in Latin America and other parts of the world, but it was also a year of resilience and resistance as millions of women from all backgrounds and continents took to the streets as part of a global movement of empowerment and activism.
Together we're stronger! Together we're braver! Together we're braver!
A sisterhood of resistance. Everyday women laying the groundwork for extraordinary change. They're all inevitably linked. These catalysts for change took their fight for equality to the streets in perhaps the largest global display of women-led mobilization. The occasion was International Women's Day. On March 8th, defiant voices flooded capital cities across the world, calling for an end to gender-based violence and femicide. Free, safe and legal abortions was also a central demand. An estimated 2,000 women die in Latin America every year due to unsafe procedures. These startling realities have helped push activists, including those in Latin America and the Caribbean, to demand deeper social and political change.
It's a deep-rooted institutional problem. In the face of the government's failure to implement effective measures, we, women, are organizing ourselves since our various institutions have failed to put mechanisms in place.
The struggle for women's rights is a struggle for women to be allowed to be human as they choose and to be valued not because they meet particular ideals, but simply because they are.
There is a package of laws that today are not fulfilled in our country, that are guaranteed by the Labor Code. For example, you have the law that permits breastfeeding in the workplace, and we know that today that is not even respected. There are not even daycare centers in any places of work that has more than 50 employees. They have to have them. Also, there is a 30% gender pay gap. Plus, the glass ceiling has not yet been shattered. Women do not have access to leadership positions that has cost us dearly.
Activists may have taken their struggles to the streets, but home, it turns out, is the most dangerous place for women. More than half of the 87,000 women killed last year around the world died at the hands of intimate partners or family members. Just imagine, that's equal to 137 women every single day, killed by persons they actually knew. The findings of a 2017 UN Global Report spotlights the number of femicides by continent. Figures show Asia is where women ran the greatest risk of being killed. 20,000 lost their lives in the last year alone. Africa follows closely with 19,000 gender-based killings. 8,000 of these types of killings were recorded across both North and South America. In fact, in Latin America alone, just under 3,000 women were murdered by those closest to them. Europe followed next with 3,000 lives lost, and Oceania with 300. But these figures are likely far greater, as many cases go unreported. We must also remember those whose stories never reached the media.
Sí a la vida! Sí a la vida! Sí a la vida!
Meanwhile, the push for change continued. There was a groundswell of support as a reproductive rights movement galvanized in Argentina and later spread throughout Latin America. In June, the Argentinian Senate would vote on a bill to allow abortion up to 14 weeks of pregnancy, following narrow approval by the lower house. The proposal was passed by the lower house by a narrow margin after a 22-hour session. The bill would make Argentina the third Latin American country to broadly legalize abortion after Cuba and Uruguay. And just outside the Congress, under the veil of night, thousands of women erupted in celebration. But their happiness was short-lived. Almost 2 months later, on August 8th, the upper house said no to the law. But all was not lost. The debate brought to the fore a new political player, the women's movements, which grew out of the Ni Una Menos, Not One Less marches against gender violence that started in 2015 and continue to grow and strengthen.
It doesn't have anything to do with this government. It has to do with feminist organizations and how the topic was made popular in many public debates. It transcends even the political arena. That's because we have presence in all parties that agree with this legislation of abortion.
This has given the movement depth and a dimension. Even with all of the associated struggles, the law seeking to ensure legal, safe, and free abortion has only received the support of the lower house at this point. This also goes hand in hand with the bid to implement secular sex education in schools. The state must also provide contraceptives to the entire population. These three pillars are going to lead us to what we need. The abortion law is therefore necessary to reduce the number of unsafe abortions in Argentina.
Social organizations, women's movements, and feminist activists in general, we have fought so much for this historical moment. After decades of fighting, we have already won on the streets, and we have also won the social debate. And even at high schools, we have won, because our students have been the ones who have rallied for adults to discuss this. And there is, in part at least, the triumph.
Women have also fought hard for their space in the political arena. In the last Brazilian presidential elections, women led the Ele Now or Not Him movement against the far-right leader of the conservative Social Liberal Party, Jair Bolsonaro, who would eventually become president. On September 29th, activists launched a wave of nationwide protests from Sao Paulo to Rio de Janeiro, and throughout several other cities, mass protests erupted in repudiation of Bolsonaro, a candidate known for disparaging women, blacks, and gays. It was only the beginning ahead of the final round of elections in October 28th.
Most people are here just to speak out on what they don't want. We don't want a macho Brazil. We don't want a homophobic Brazil. We don't want a country that rejects minorities. So it's a fight for our evolution. Because we don't want backtracking. We don't want dictatorships. We just want the right to freedom of expression. We don't want women to earn less than men. This is a struggle for women's rights, which are human rights.
As you can see in these protests, there are white, black, homosexual people. There are fathers and mothers. It's a very diverse group. And this type of candidate and this type of policy does not represent Brazilian culture.
As a black woman, I would never vote for a misogynistic man. I would never vote for a man who says a woman could be raped, because it's against every principle and right women have fought for historically.
Still, the campaign to end violence against women kept going.
Queremos ser libres, libres, no valientes.
Women across the globe continue to take a stand against gender-based violence. This as the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women was observed in November. On this day, the Dominican Republic was first set to honor the three Maribel sisters who were murdered by the Trujillo dictatorship. And further afield in Ecuador, thousands flooded the city streets. Students, members of indigenous communities, and different women's organizations marched to raise awareness. People of all ages and from all backgrounds came together against domestic violence, sexual abuse, and harassment of women. And at the same time, in Syria's northeast, dozens of Kurdish women marched in solidarity with their sisters around the world. Women played an important role in freeing the region from the Islamic State group.
Many women in Africa continue to be victims of violence. What Turkey is doing is exactly what Daesh used to do. The murders still continue and they still face violence.
Transgender women, transgender people have an age limit. We ought to be dead for society by the age of 35. I only have 13 years left, and I need this remaining time I have left to tell people stop murdering trans people. Today we are also here to thank those transgender people and sex workers who helped to decriminalize same-sex relationships in 1997 in Ecuador. Thanks to them, gay men and women can walk on the streets today a bit more freely.
In our work, women are often oppressed with phrases that diminish their ability. They are told they can't do certain tasks because they are women, or they are told they need to take care of their homes and therefore don't have time to work.
In 2018, through activism, women stood tall on the shoulders of those unsung heroes who fought before them. Together they raised their voices for those who were not heard. In many countries, the state still controls women's bodies and reproductive choices, especially brown and black ones. No doubt, the movement for women's rights reached a crescendo in 2018, and this gave space for a broader debate. As 2019 approaches, surely the wave of feminism is far from over.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Welcome back. Electoral authorities in the Democratic Republic of Congo have collected voting material from polling stations in the Goma region for its counting. The country went to the polls on December 30th for an election that has been delayed 3 times since 2016. Violence was not reporting on voting day. The country has never had a peaceful transition of power since it gained independence from Belgium in 1960. At least 8 people have died and dozens remain trapped after a residential building collapsed in Russia due to a gas explosion. Rescuers are looking for at least 40 people trapped. A baby was among the survivors. The explosion collapsed a great section of the building.
There was a bang, as if something had blown up in the street. My husband went downstairs, then returned and said to get ready quickly as our building had collapsed.
3 people have been injured after a man stabbed them in Manchester in a train station on New Year's Eve. Police said they are treating the event as a terror attack. Among the victims were a woman and a man in their 50s and a male police officer. Police said they will reinforce their presence in the city that was hit by a suicide bomb attack in 2017 that killed 22 people. The United States and Israel have formally quit UNESCO, the UN Educational, Scientific and Cultural Agency. The administration of U.S. President Donald Trump announced its withdrawal in October 2017, following Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Both countries accused the UN organization of being Israeli biased. The UNESCO have previously criticized the Israeli occupation of Jerusalem and granted Palestine membership in 2011. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. These and many other stories, as always, find them on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.